Hello. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. So a couple of years ago, as I'm sure you all know, Microsoft launched the Zune. And because it is a consumer product and a music device on top of that, it was really important for us to create a strong brand image, which meant that we spent a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of resources figuring out what that brand image should be and what the experience of Zune should be on the device and the players. Well, that, of course, also translated to the web. And the experience of a user when you go to Zune.net is to have a Zune experience. If instead you go to the Zune.net and you get a generic-looking page with nondescript-looking controls, you're not going to have a good reaction to it. In fact, it's going to feel a little bit unprofessional, inconsistent. Which is why Zune.net, of course, provides a very branded experience to its users. When you go to Zune.net, all the different controls, all the different colors, the buttons, the list box, the hyperlinks, they all conform to and are in line with the Zune brand. And this is something that market research over the last couple years has really emphasized on the web. This fact that having a strong brand image attracts and retains customers to your sites and to your products. And one of the key differentiators of a strongly branded site is the fact that that brand image, that company experience, permeates every single aspect of every single page, which includes having controls that enhance and extend your brand's experience. My name is Karen Corby, and I'm a program manager on the Silverlight team. And today I'd like to talk to you about how you can use Silverlight 3 to build controls that really bring out your site's brand image. Concretely, what does that mean? Well, we'll talk about how you can customize existing controls and how you'll do that through either styling or skinning. We'll also look at data binding and how it plays with controls and what the new features we added in Silverlight 3 are. And finally, we'll look at the power of layout and how you can create custom panels that really highlight the controls in your application. So let's get started. Like I said, there are two different ways of customizing existing controls. There's styling and there's skinning. Styling, for those of you who are familiar with CSS and HTML, the property bag styling scenario should be very familiar to you. It's a way for you to likely tweak different visual aspects of your control. So say change the color of the control, the font size, the border, just light customizations. The way you do this in Silverlight is through the style element, which is really just a property bag, a list of properties and a list of those property values, which you can in turn then apply to different elements in Silverlight, like controls or user controls or shapes or panels. And with that, let's get into a demo. Okay. So in the session today, we're going to build up a little bit of a Wish Viewer app. And the website that I'm using in order to get all the data for this Wish app is a site called wishpot.com. It has a third-party web service with a client access policy associated, which means that from Silverlight you can call into it and get your users' wishes and show some interesting data. So what I've got up here is some interesting data because I really want this camera, but not so pretty of a site. And what we'll do now is show how you can use styling to make this app and this site come alive. So inside of this application, the main page is called mainpage.xaml. And I have in here a grid, which is the root layout, as well as a smaller grid with a banner. But notice that the border and the image right now is blank, which is why you didn't see it. And then the main section also has a grid, a border, which held that image, and a series of text blocks and text boxes. And what we'll do now is use styling to customize the way these things look. Now, in Silverlight 2, the most natural place for you to define styles and other resources was in app.xaml. But one of the enhancements that we've done in Silverlight 3 is add a feature called merged resource dictionaries. And this allows me to have a better asset management story because I can place resources in different top-level resource dictionaries in different files. So here I've got a styles.xaml that I've set up that's a resource dictionary, and an assets.xaml, which is also a resource dictionary. And I'm going to start in assets.xaml. Now, for those of you who are not as familiar with resources, resources in Silverlight are a great way in XAML to define an asset that you want to use multiple times throughout your application. So great examples of resources are things like brushes. So for instance, I'm going to drag in here a banner brush asset. It has a key, and that's because every resource needs to be keyed in some way so I can reference it later. So here's my banner brush, and I'm also going to define a custom namespace so I can specify the path of my logo image as well. And these are the two things that I'm going to keep in my asset.xaml. And then I will actually define my styles not in asset.xaml, but styles.xaml. And that way I can have that clean asset management. So in here, I'm going to define some styles that use the things we just defined. And the way you hook that up is with the syntax called merge resource dictionaries. So here I'm saying, please merge in all the resources that I just defined in this other resource dictionary called assets.xaml. So now I can define my first style element. Notice again that this is a style, and it has a key so that I can reference it later. And it has a target type, which specifies that this style should be applied only to elements of type border. Now, inside of a style, I specify a bunch of different setters. And the great thing about setters is that they're just very intuitive. It says, please set this property background to some value. And in this case, the value that I want it to be is that banner brush, that color brush that we just defined. And so I'll do that by using a syntax called static resource reference. And this just says, please at parse time, go find that banner brush that I defined earlier. Now similarly, I'm going to define a logo style, which will be of type image, and uses that logo source that we also defined in assets.xaml. And then let's go ahead and hook up this resource dictionary. I'll go back into app.xaml, say, for my application level resources, please use the resource dictionary that I defined in styles.xaml. And now in my main page, I can go back to this banner area, say to the border, please, for your style property, use the banner style that we just defined, again using that static resource reference, and similarly with a logo. And very simply then, I can start to make progress on the way our app looks. So there's my logo and my banner. So let's make this look even better by adding a few more assets. I'll drag in here a linear gradient brush for the background, a solid color brush for the outline, and then the path for some different fonts. And then within style.xaml, I'll define 3 more styles, or 4. An image border style, a field tray style, a label style, and a text box styles. And these just, again, will set different properties with specific values that I can then apply in page.xaml. So let's do that as well. Going to set this grid to be the background style we just defined. This border to get the image border style. The stack panel to get the field tray style. And then apply label style here throughout. And similarly with my text box style. Okay. And now hitting Control F5 again, suddenly our app is starting to have some shape to it. One of the things that I notice up here right away, though, is all these text boxes, it makes sense. I use the same style for each of them. But these fields should really be of different length, right? I'm getting cut off here. And unless I'm really ambitious, I'm never going to find something that costs quite that much, although I'm sure I could if I really tried. So let's go ahead and customize this a little bit further. Inside of styles.xaml, what I want is to take this text box style and actually just tweak it a little bit further for those different text boxes in my app. In Silverlight 3, we've included, fortunately enough, a feature called Based on Styles. And this allows you to extend a style that you've already defined by adding additional setters to it. So I can go in here and create a single line text box style, which is based on the text box style that I just defined up here. And so it'll inherit all of those setters, but I can also override them by saying, instead of using the width I defined up here, which is 200, I'm going to use the width down here, which is 350. And I can do the same thing with a few others. And now when I go back into mainpage.xaml, I can just hook these up. So that each of these is using a different, I guess, extended style. And now when I run it, you can see just like that, I'm still using the base text box style, but each of the individual fields are customized a little bit further. And just to really prove this point, I'm going to go back into styles.xaml and decrease the font size, and I don't have to this time go into 5 different text box styles. I can just go to that base text box style, decrease the font size to 15, and see how it replicates very easily throughout all those text boxes. So that's based on styles. Now, bubbling up, one of the powers of styles and resources in general is because they are keyed. It's very easy to drop in different sets of styles and then very easily change the way your application looks. So if I go into my styles.xaml all the way at the top, and instead of using assets.xaml, I instead use raise.xaml, which is a different resource dictionary that defines all the same assets, but differently. Now when I run this, just by swapping in a different resource dictionary, I can have a little bit more of a swirly experience. And you can take that a step further too by not just changing the assets, but actually going in here into my app.xaml and changing the styles themselves. I notice I haven't changed any of the actual elements on the page. I haven't changed my text box or the text box. I've just changed different visual properties on the control with styles and resources. And so you can see here I've got a little bit of a gratuitous projection effect and some drop shadows, and I've changed the layout. So cool. Switch back into slides for a moment. So that, very briefly, was styling. And we highlighted a couple of the new Silverlight 3 features. One is based on styles, which allows you to extend a style that already exists and add more setters. And the second is merge resource dictionaries, which means that you no longer will have to have 3,000 line resource dictionary files. Although if you wanted to, you probably still could. Oh, well that, very briefly, was my next slide, which is an interlude into skinning. So styling was a very easy way to change just light visual properties on the specific control without actually changing the core visuals themselves. Skinning, on the other hand, is how you change and completely replace the control's visuals. Now skinning is a little bit more complicated of a subject than styling, so I'm going to go into a little bit deeper of an overview of skinning before we get into the demo. Okay. So inside of Silverlight 3, the way you do skinning is through control templates. Control templates is where you actually define what you want the control to look like. And then you can use a template binding to link, if necessary, between the control template's visuals and the visual properties on the control itself. and we'll see how you do that in a little bit. Now, as a call out, skinning only works with a certain type of control, and that's custom controls. Skinning does not work with user controls because there's a much tighter coupling, and it doesn't work with panels or shapes. And that's because custom controls are a little bit unique. We have, with custom controls, a very defined separation between the control's logic and the control's visuals. And that's because the control is defined in a control class that derives from control, and the visuals are defined in this control template. And there's a very distinct line between the two of them, which is a good thing. It means that you can plug in a new control template without needing to touch or even have access to the control code. The trouble and the challenge with this, however, is that a lot of times there's two different people in this equation, because it turns out that most developers aren't great designers. And what that means is the designer is off to the side trying to figure out what they need to put into the control template in order to get the control to actually work well. And wouldn't it be great for the control developer to just very explicitly say, you know what, designer, I need certain things from you. I need a thumb, I need the way the control should look in the press state, in the mouse over state. And then it's very easy for the designer to come in and provide those experiences and those elements inside of the control template. This leads us to the parts and states model in Silverlight. And it's a way to make your controls, your custom controls, very easily skinnable. We keep that very defined separation between logic and visuals, but by providing a control contract, now both the developer and the designer can be much more in sync with each other. This parts and states model is a recommended pattern inside of Silverlight. And what this means is it's not used by the runtime directly, and so you're perfectly welcome not to use it if you don't want to. That being said, we do think it is a good pattern, and it is a pattern supported by Blend. So if you want your controls to be skinnable in Blend, we recommend you use this pattern. So what is in the parts and states model? Well, not surprisingly, the first thing is parts. Parts are named elements that live inside of a template. And the reason why they're named and the reason why they need to be in the control contract is that the code will go in and manipulate them in some way. Now, parts are optional. It's not required that you use them, and a lot of controls don't. But on the other hand, a lot of controls do. So take a look at this slider. It's actually important that the control code knows about 4 different parts, because if the user clicks on the thumb and attempts to drag it, they need to programmatically move the thumb along that track. And similarly, if the user clicks on the up repeat button or the down repeat button, they need to move that slider along the track. And so that's why we have parts. The second element of the parts and states model is states. States are a way for you to define the way a control template should look in the mouse over state or in the press state. They're defined using the visual state element inside of the control template. And again, as a call out, not all states or not all controls have states. Again, it depends on the particular control. So up here is a picture of the way the button might look in, say, the mouse over state, and how it'll look a little bit darker in the press state. Between states are transitions, and this is how the control looks as it goes between, say, the mouse over state to the press state. Maybe there's a bit of a gradient or an animation. And the way you define this inside of a control template is using the visual transition element. Now, the last part of this is state groups. State groups are sets of mutually exclusive states that are bundled together. Different state groups within a control are orthogonal. And so what that means here is if I have a common states state group and a focus states state group, it's possible for me to be in, say, the normal state as well as the focus state. But it's not possible, of course, to be in both the focused and unfocused state at the same time, because both of those states are within the focus states state group. So the set of state groups that you see up here are actually the states that live in a text box. And that's because the next thing we're going to do is skin a text box. Okay, so going back into our wish details demo here, you might remember this rating text box. And you might have also noticed that all the way out here, I've got a set of bindings where I've set my data context for this to be a wish. And here I'm binding the text property of this text box to the rating property on my data object. And I've also explicitly set to notify on validation errors and validate on exceptions. And that's because my rating, I want it to always be between 1 and 5. Which means now when I run this, just to give everybody a little bit of context, I'll see my rating text box. You'll notice that I'll have a mouse over effect here. There's also a focused and unfocused visual state of this text box. And if I enter in a number that's not valid and tab away, I'll get some validation UI. A little bit of a red border, and if I hover over this, I'll get the error message. Or similarly, if I tab into it. So that's kind of the visual look of this text box, and we want to go ahead now and redefine the way this text box looks. And we'll do that by going back into styles.xaml. I'm going to reopen a different snippets manager. Okay. So in styles.xaml, all the way down here at the bottom, I'm going to define a new style. And this style is going to be called rating text box style, and it will derive from the short text box style that we created a few minutes ago. Now, inside of the style setter, I'm going to set the template property. And I do that because template is a property on the control just like any other property, and I can supply it with a control template. Inside of this control template, I can put whatever visuals I want to make up this text box. So I'm going to start with a grid, and after that, drag in a few other visuals. Here is a border. So my text box is going to have a border, which is black and has a border thickness of 1. And then it will have this kind of star vector that I've created. So the last thing is to re-hook up our text box here, not to use short text box style, but rating text box style. And running it, now you can see I've got a cool little rating. I'm a star text box. But you'll notice also that I've lost some of the other visual properties that I had set. Our border's no longer gray. It no longer has a little bit of a difference in thickness. And so what I want actually inside of this template that I've defined is not to hard code these values on this border, but to actually have them respect the properties on the control itself. And the way I do that is by using template bindings. So what this does is it says, for this border, please set the background to be template bound to the background property on the text box. And similarly, use the border brush property on the text box, as well as border thickness. So now by hooking up those properties, if I run this again, I now have, again, that nice consistent look for my text box. There is, of course, something missing, which is there's no text in my text box, small detail. And that's because text box actually has a part. The platform needs to know where to put the textability of the text box. And I can do that by providing it the desired content element part. And I, again, specify the content element just by giving it the name that the controller has asked for. So now, yay, we have text, and I can type in it. Woohoo. However, we're still missing some of the visual feel, right? I can mouse over this and there's no change. I can tab into it, and besides being able to type into it, it still doesn't have the full visual feel of a text box. And so the next thing we need to do is add in here some visual states. The way we do that is by specifying the visual state groups on the root visual of the control template. So here I've set visual state manager.visual state groups on the root element, which is a grid, for my text box control template. And then I can drag in here some states. first I specify the state group that I care about, in this case common states, and I can add in here a normal state because by default I want the control to just look like what it looks like normally, and then a mouse over state where I specify a storyboard, and I have that star vector that we defined, we actually have it grow. So I'm setting the scale properties here to get larger, to be 1.5. And by running this, I now very simply have, by mousing over and adding that visual state, a look for our mouse over state. But it's kind of jumpy. It's not exactly, great. So what we want is a smoother transition into that mouse over state. And with the parts and states model, it's very easy to do that by adding an element called visual transitions. So inside of this visual state group, I'm going to add a series of visual transitions. And here I can say that I want the generated durations of all these automatically created transitions to be of a certain length. And Visual State Manager will actually go in and create animations for all the different properties that you animated in the different states. So here, in my mouse over state, because I supplied that visual transition just that easily, I get a nice, smooth transition back and forth. Now, having a little bit of fun with this, we did add easing functions in Silverlight. And so I can add a second visual transition here where I explicitly state what storyboard I want to be used for a particular transition. And I can say, please only use this visual transition when you're going into the mouse over state. So now, because I supplied that special storyboard, when I go in, I can pop out a little bit. But when I mouse away, I still get that automatic transition, which is pretty cool. So to round things out, I'm going to very quickly add a visual look to our control when it's in the focus state. And I'll do that by dropping in a focus visual. This focus visual will start out by having an opacity of 0, but in my visual states, I will actually create some visual focus states, and in the focused state of this, I will animate that opacity to be 1. So now, when I tab in and out, I get that focus visual. So the next part, which I think is actually really cool, and one of the new features that we add in Silverlight 3, is how we specify validation UI inside of Silverlight. We have this whole model built up now around states. And wouldn't it be great if validation was just treated like any other visual state inside of the control? And we can do that. I'm going to start here by adding in some error UI. So here I've got an error blur whose opacity starts out to be 0, and also an error border whose opacity starts out to be 0. I can add in here a tooltip, and inside of this tooltip I have an error message. And I can bind the placement target of this tooltip using a binding with the relative source syntax. Now, for those of you who played with Silverlight 2, you'll notice that this is a new behavior in binding. We didn't have relative source behavior before. So you couldn't use binding to bind to the templated parent. You had to use template binding. And the trouble with that is template binding had some limitations, which meant that you couldn't use template binding and converters. You couldn't use template bindings and different paths or subpaths. And now that we have templated parent, you can do all those things onto the templated control. So putting in the tooltip here and the text, I'm going to put a text box inside of my tooltip, and again use that relative source to bind to the templated parent. But this time, I'm actually going to specify a very long path. And this path says, please put the text message of this error, grab that text from the validation.errors attached property, which will show up whenever there's an error. So by hooking up those things and finally dragging in my validation states, which toggle the opacity, and I'm not going to go into detail because they look very similar to the last ones, I can run this and type in 3, type in 4, type in 10, tab away, and I get this nice pulsating really subtle effect. And if I tab back in, I will get a big glaring "you're an idiot" message, which is always fabulous. And so I will correct myself and put a 3 and tab away and be happy again. And just to emphasize my happiness, I am going to add in here a visual transition inside of the validation states, so that when I put 10, tab away, and tab back, I get a little bit more gratification because it will turn green as it animates out. Now, thank you. Now, one of the things here that you'll notice is I had a lot of tabbing in and out, right? Type, tab, back, tab, which isn't really what you want either. Because we're using bindings, and the default behavior for a binding in a text box is that it flushes back to the source whenever you tab away. In Silverlight 3, we're giving you the ability to override that. So if I go into my main page and go back to that binding, I can add in another value which says update source trigger equals explicit. And what that means is that by default, the binding is never going to get flushed. I have to do it manually, which I'm totally fine with, because what that means is I can add a key up handler, and in my code behind, define it. So whenever a key gets pressed, I will grab the binding expression, so kind of the binding, the object that describes the binding, from the rating text box, and I grab it for the text property, which has the binding on it, and then simply call update source. So rerunning this, I can now go in here, type 1,000 and wonder why it didn't work. I copied it. Oh, you guys saw that and it didn't tell me as I did it? Someone's trying to make me look like an idiot. Okay, correcting myself. Put that, there we go. Okay, so rerunning this with the correct code, I can now, and get it automatically, and if I go back, I can get real-time updates. So that's pretty cool, and something that we added in Silverlight 3. Okay. So that is skinning. You can see in that we are able to completely replace the look of a control by supplying a control template. And then inside of that control template, you can specify how the control should look in different visual states using these elements. So Visual State Manager.Visual State Groups is where you define your different state groups. The Visual State Group element is where you define sets of mutually exclusive states. And the Visual State element itself is where you provide a storyboard to say what your control should look like in that particular state. Visual transitions are also very cool because they're a great way to make your controls seem a little bit more fluid and a little bit more interesting. You can use a Visual State Manager to create automatic transitions for you by just setting the generated duration property, or you can go in and specify an explicit transition yourself by giving it a storyboard. There's also ways to specify which transitions you want to use at a given point. So if you want to use, a particularly loud, flashy transition going from one state to another, you can specify that with a specific from-to state transition. And then as a final call out, we did add easing functions inside of Silverlight 3, which can add a lot of pizzazz to your app. And for RTW of Silverlight 3, we will be adding a generated easing function to the visual transition class, which means that you can get that level of customization without having to provide a storyboard, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Okay. We saw a little bit of validation in that demo, and I just wanted to talk you through it a little bit because it happened pretty fast. So in that text box, you saw that we supplied a visual state valid and invalid look inside of the control template. And we also bound the text box.text property. So what happened is in that two-way binding, when it got flushed, the new value got sent to the binding engine. And then that new value was passed along to the data object that was backing it. Inside of that data object, if it determined that it was not a valid value, it threw an exception which the binding engine caught. The binding engine then turned around and went back to the text box and initiated a validation state change. So it went into the invalid focused or invalid unfocused state. It also passed along an attached property validation.errors, and that's where you go to grab the actual error text that you want to show in the control template. As a call out, in order to get all this to work, for bindings to play with validation, you need to turn on two flags. The first is notify on validation errors, and the second is validates on exceptions. You also saw that it's possible to manually and explicitly update a binding if you want to. All you have to do is set the update source trigger to be true, and then call update source on the associated binding expression. And finally, another call out on bindings, we did add the relative source property on the binding itself, which means you can now bind to the templated parent or even yourself if you want to inside of a control template, which means that the full power of bindings are now available in a template, which just makes life a lot easier. Also, as a call out, which I didn't show, but for those of you who've done a lot of data binding will be happy to hear, we do now allow dependency properties to act as the source of a data binding. Previously, you could only use CLR objects, so I'm sure many of you will be happy about that. Okay. Out of the box, in Silverlight 3, many of our controls are set up to look good and have real validation UI out of the box. So all the input controls that you might expect, if you plop on your page and get an error, they'll look exactly what you would expect them to. They'll show up red and give you an error message. With a call out that password box right now is not data bindable and it doesn't have validation UI, but we will be changing that for RTW. Okay. So you saw in that last demo how to do skinning in Visual Studio, but that of course is not always the easiest way to do things. So I wanted to show you very briefly what the experience is like in Blend, with the caveat that I'm not a designer. So set expectations low, and I'll feel better about myself. Okay, so I'm going to open up a project in here. And start off by getting a little bit of help from someone who already created a star for me in Illustrator. So I can, with Blend's new Illustrator import, just grab it. Let me shrink this down a little bit. Ooh, there we go. And now I can grab this star, right-click on it, and very simply select Make into a Control. So that's just a graphic. I'm saying, please make this into a control. I'm going to select text box here. Give it a name for the style, so star text box. And I'd, for asset management, like this to be created in a new resource dictionary, which I'm going to call skins.xaml. So this will take me into the template editing pane inside of Blend. And in here, I can in here, I can look at the different parts and states for this control. Sorry, I auto hid some things in here. There we go. Okay, so inside of this, I can see all the different states for my text box. And again, Blend is able to pick all that up because I am using the parts and states model inside of the text box. And I can also see the one part that I need to add. So I'll go ahead and add that first. If I zoom in a little bit more, you'll see that it actually says text box over there. And I'm going to drag this guy kind of to the center, or attempt to. Okay, well, again, I'm not a designer, sorry. But I will try my hardest to make this not look incredibly ugly. So here's what my control looks like in the normal state. That's great. For the mouse over state, I'm just going to have it grow a little bit. So I'm going to go over to my transforms down here and do a scale transform and have this get rather larger. Okay, so now it's really big. That was normal. This is mouse over. And for the moment, I don't care that much about disabled or read-only. The next thing that I'm going to do is touch the validation states. So here again is what it looks like when it's valid. When it's invalid, I'd like to change the color here. So I'll make this red, and this red as well. And then go in here and make this red. So yes, very distinctive. And because a lot of times I don't really care whether or not this control will be unfocused or not, I'm going to just right-click here and say, please just copy the state into the invalid focus state so that it can be done. So there's our different states. Now the last thing I need to do to get this to work is go back to my main control.xaml and hook up the text property. So by doing this, I can select my text box. Here is, sorry, the resolution here is kind of tricky. So I'm going to select here and go to data binding. I'm going to create a new CLR object data source and grab the wish object that I've been using in the back to drive things and select the rating field. Now there is one piece of magic that I have to do at the moment because Blend's not set up to turn on those validation flags. So I'm going to go in here and just grab those properties and edit the XAML directly. And now when I run this, you will see my really pretty text box, which I can type into. And when I tab away, it will not turn red. What did I do? Let's go back in here. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to assume it's user error because it's probably user error. And if anybody's interested, I can get it to work at the end. Okay, so moving on. Okay. Oh, and I got distracted, so I missed my other big announcement. So let's go in here. So this is probably going to be both the coolest and the least exciting demo, because the XAML here is not that great, and the look of it is not that great, but it's showing off something pretty cool. So let's see how many of you can figure out why this demo is cool. And it will only be people who've played with Silverlight too. So here's a list box with a series of styles in it, and here's my text box. And if I select this, I change the style. If I did this, I change the style again. And so for those of you who subtly noticed this, I was able to do two things here. If you look into the XAML, I was able to, one, changed the style property of this text box at runtime, which meant that we removed the write once behavior of the style property. And the second is, without writing any XAML, I'm able to use, or without writing any code, I'm able to hook this up by using element name UI to UI binding, which is pretty cool. So that was my very exciting demo to show off these two new features that we added in Silverlight 3, and hopefully you guys will use them well. To follow that, which is a little bit of on a different note, there are still some differences between styling in Silverlight and styling in WPF. It is the same model, but it is a subset, and so there are things that you can do in WPF that you still can't do in Silverlight today. And these are things that we are planning on introducing in the future. And what we want is to understand your feedback and what the relative priorities are of these features among themselves, as well as in other areas of the product. So we don't have implicit styles today in Silverlight 3. That's where you can define a style for, say, a button in one place and have it automatically get picked up by all the different buttons inside of your application. We do have a workaround in the toolkit. If you go to the toolkit talk, which is immediately after that, you can learn a little bit more about the implicit style manager. But we don't have anything that supports that behavior inside of the core runtime today. We also only have dynamic resources. We only have static resources. We don't yet have dynamic resources. And what that means is we can't detect changes to the resources that you've defined at runtime. We only look at what is available at parse time. And the final is that we don't have triggers today. There is a workaround with Blend's behaviors that they've introduced, which allows a lot of interactivity to be done inside of XAML without needing to go to code. That being said, it's still not in the core runtime, and it is something that we'd like to add in the future. So again, feedback on this list is very much appreciated. Okay. So we talked a lot about how you can change the look of an existing control. But there are a lot of times when what's in the toolbox or what is in the core runtime just isn't enough, which means that you'll have to build your own custom control. And the example that we're going to do today is actually switching from using a text box to enter our rating, and we're actually going to create a rating control. So up here is my very complicated design of what my rating control would look like, and you'll notice there'll be 5 different stars. Okay. So I'm going to close this project. And open up this one. Okay. So like we saw, our rating control is going to have 5 different stars. And in order to compartmentalize it and kind of be able to reuse our assets in the best way, I'm going to start by creating a star control, which our rating control will then use. So if I go into my starControl.cs, you'll see I have an empty control class, star control that derives from control. And the first thing that I'll want to do is add in the control contract. And the way I do this is by specifying several attributes on the control class itself called, template visual state attribute. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze really loudly into the microphone. Okay, so in our star control, there are 5 different visual states and 2 different state groups. We have the emphasis states, which will have a look for the control when it's updated, emphasized, and understated, as well as a starred, unstarred look in the star states. So that's our control contract. Let's go ahead and also add some properties. Not surprisingly, they're related. So we have an is_starred property, an is_updated property, and an is_emphasized property. Now, the way we tell the control template to go into different visual states is we have to explicitly manage the logical state of the control and then tell the control template, please go into this visual state. To make this easier, it's useful to create a helper function called update visual state, which will take in a bool to toggle whether or not we should use transitions for a particular visual state change. And then you have a series of cascading if statements. So here is emphasized. If it's true, we'll call the visual state manager.goToState static method and pass it in the instance of the control, the name of the state that we're trying to go to, and whether or not we should use transitions. And we do the same thing down here with the star states. Now, when do we actually need to update the visual state of the control? Well, the first time is right when the template is applied, so when the control first gets its visual look. And we do that by overriding the onApplyTemplate method. Now, this virtual gets called whenever the template is applied, and at that point, we'll update the visual state. And in this particular visual state change, we don't want to use transitions. And the reason is, if you think about it, when the control appears on the page, you just want it to appear. You don't want it to animate in. You just want it to arrive. On the other hand, when you change other properties, like isStarred, you'll want to update the visual state, but you will most likely want to use transitions. So I'll go ahead and add a few more update visual state calls. Okay, so that's our control, our star control. We've done our logic. It was pretty simple. Next, we have to specify where the control should get its look. And by default, whenever you create a control, you want to ship it so it looks like something. And the way you do that is by specifying a built-in style inside of generic.xaml. Now, generic.xaml is a special resource dictionary. It's one that the platform does know about. And so it needs to be located in the themes directory of your control class library. And you actually want to build it in a special way as well. You want to include it in your assembly as a resource and not as a normal page. Okay, so here's our generic.xaml resource dictionary, and I will drag in a built-in style for the star control. Unlike the other style resources that you've seen, you'll notice that I don't specify a key here. And that's because the platform within the generic.xaml resource dictionary will look up the style based on the target type, which in this case is star control. So I can drag in here a setter to set this template, and then also drag in some visuals. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see there were my visuals, and here are the star states and the different episode state groups. Now, the last part to get all of this hooked up right is we defined our control class with our logic. We defined our built-in style with our control look. We need to tell the platform how to find these things. And you do that by, inside of your constructor for your control, setting the default style key property. And what this does is it tells us, hey, for the star control, please go to the generic.xaml that's found in the assembly where star control was defined and use that built-in style. Now, that might sound like obvious logic that you might always want, but actually there's many cases where, say, you derive from a button and you don't want to, and you create mybutton.cs. You don't want to actually go to the effort of creating a new default look for mybutton.cs. You just want to use the default look for button. And in that case, you would use type of the parent. Okay, so let's put our star control on the main page. And you can see here, I put my star control, and I've also hooked up a bunch of event handlers. And I'm doing that so that I can toggle the properties on our star control so we can actually see it move. So this star control is actually going to be kind of small, so hopefully you see it. But that's because it's going to eventually be one of many. And if I mouse over this, it's going to grow. And when I click on it, it's going to bounce a little bit and become starred. So cool. That's our star control. Now let's actually make it a rating control. Going into ratingcontrol.cs, I'm again deriving from control. And in this case, I don't care as much about providing a really complicated look for rating control. I just want to say, for my rating control designer, please give me 5-star controls. That's all I care about. And I can do that by using the template part attribute. Now this again is a class level attribute, and you give it the name of the part that you're expecting and what type it should be. Okay. Now, of course, inside of our control, we need to have somewhere to put those stars. So I'm creating a list of star controls and also adding some public properties, namely a rating property, which in this case is a dependency property because I care about allowing it to play with data binding and styling. And also a flag is interactive so that I can toggle whether or not our rating control is essentially read-only. Okay. So let's go ahead now and write the logic of how to grab the star controls that are inside of our control template. And we do that again by overriding the onApply template virtual, because that gets called whenever a template is applied. But the tricky part here is that designers can be fickle beasts, and they don't always give us what we want. And so we need to make sure that as we're reaching into the control template to get a particular part, that we act gracefully if it's not there, because the designer may be in the process of building up the control, or they may decide just not to put a particular control for whatever reason. So here inside of my add star part helper, I look for get template child, and if it doesn't exist, I just silently don't add it to my internal queue. So inside of onApply template, I will look up my 5 different stars and then hook up mouse event handlers on each of them because I care about whether or not they're being clicked. Also, since it is possible for templates to be applied more than once, I need to make sure I have the logic to get rid of the old stars in an old template and be able to grab the new stars in the new template. And so I'm going to add in some logic here to unhook the event handlers if I happen to already have some hooked up, and to clear out my star vector. Now the last part of this, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because it's just control logic and it's not as interesting. But I need to have some way of going through and telling the individual stars whether or not they should be starred or unstarred or emphasized or unemphasized. So just very quickly, I've created a show rating of helper method. I'm going to call it inside of my onApply template at the very end. I will also call it in all of these event handlers that I've been hooking up in my stars, as well as some of the event handlers on the rating control itself. And finally, I also need to update it if someone changes, where did it go? If someone changes the rating property, I need to be able to respond to that. And the way I do that is inside of my register method here, instead of passing null, I actually say, please call this change notification on rating change whenever the rating property changes. And inside of that, I will call my helper method, show rating of. Then finally, of course, I need to provide a default look for my rating control. So inside of generic.xaml, all the way at the bottom, I will have a rating control here. It has the 5 parts that I'm expecting, which is great. And then I just need to tell the platform inside of the rating control constructor to go ahead and use that default style. So a lot of hookup there, but I wanted to let you see it very briefly. And then we actually need to add our rating control to our main page and clear out all the event handlers that I added previously. Okay, lots of mouse movements. Let's look at our new app. And here's our rating control. And I can mouse over it. And it tells, because I've hooked up all those event handlers, to each of those 5 parts inside of the rating control, it toggles the state appropriately on those controls, and I can click on them. And you can see the little bit of logic that I added there. So isn't that nicer than a text box? Yes, it is. Okay. So just to round this out, because like I said at the beginning, we are building up a wish viewer app. I'm going to create a wish control just very briefly. So inside of my wish control, I will add my default style key from the start. I'm going to add one property, which is a wish property, which will hold the data object for our wish control, and then provide a built-in style for it. And this, of course, uses the rating control we just created. And now, oh, but I actually have to put it on my page. I got a little excited. And then hook up the data context. Which will now show you the second thing that I've been craving recently. Oh. Yeah. Okay. I think I might have a typo in generic.saml. Oh, there we go. No? Okay, does anybody see anything that I'm doing wrong? Pardon?
Any chance your rating may be 0?
No, do 2. I have nothing to say about that. Yeah, this is why I'm a program manager and not a developer. Anyways, okay, so there's our wish control, and it works. And the next thing I'm going to very briefly do is show you how you can move that into a WPF app. So, and now I'm a little scared because I'm going to be dragging in code here, but here is a WPF application that I set up. And what I want to show is how, when you start in Silverlight and you try to move assets to WPF, how it's very easily, how that process can be very easy. So if I open up the location where I was just at with that and pass all the data objects that I just created and put it into my Wishbot control library in WPF, and then I drag in my generic.xaml also into that control library. There will have to be a few things that I fix up here. If you're interested in learning more about how this continuum works, there is a session right after this that talks about it. So I would highly recommend you go there to get much more detail. But there are a few things inside of generic.xaml that I'm using today in Silverlight that actually don't translate directly. The first is I had a viewbox that I was using in one of my templates, and viewbox is in the toolkit in Silverlight. It's actually in the core runtime in WPF. So I can go ahead and get rid of that reference, and inside of viewbox, get rid of the XMLNS prefix. What just happened? Okay. The next thing that you'll see is I'm getting an error around Visual State Group. And that's because in the current version of WPF, Visual State Manager and all the associated classes aren't in the core runtime yet. They're in the WPF toolkit. That will change in the next release of WPF. So I can go up here and add a reference to the WPF toolkit. And that will get rid of that. The final thing here is that I am using some of the easing functions that are in Silverlight and that are not yet in WPF. That also will be added to the next version of WPF. So for the moment, I'm just going to go ahead and comment these out and get rid of them. And now, assuming that I haven't messed anything up, there is our wish control running in WPF, just like that. Yeah. If you're curious and you go up to the WPF toolkit, there's also a lot more instructions on how to use Visual State Manager with control skins where the controls actually live in the core runtime. So if you create a text box style or a button style, using Visual State Manager and Silverlight, there is a path to get those into WPF. Switch it back to slides. So just really quickly to review, here's, we saw how to create a new custom control and how controls are lookless by default, how you need to provide a default look for that control in generic.xaml, and how you hook it up using the default style key. Specifying the control contract, you do that on the control class itself using two different attributes, the template part attribute and the template visual state attribute. And then you derive the changes inside the control logic, the different visual state changes using Visual State Manager.goToState. In WPF and in Silverlight, we have the same skinning model, but there are things that we're continuously moving from WPF into Silverlight, and some of the new features we've added to Silverlight that are migrating to WPF. Again, I recommend you see that talk that's right after this on the continuum. So the last thing, and it's very short because I know I'm a little bit over, is I wanted to talk about layout. Layout in Silverlight is a two-pass algorithm. So you go through a measure phase and an arrange phase. And by using this, you can create your own custom panels. So the measure phase looks something like this. Layout says to the panel, so how much space do you need? And the panel says, well, let me check with my children, so be right back. And the panel then goes, okay, I asked my kids, they need, like, oh my God, a lot of space. And the layout goes, sweet, gotcha, okay, talk to you later. So that's measure. At least that's what measure sounds like at 3 a.m. when you're doing slides. And then here is arrange. Layout says, okay, I got your space for you. Arrange yourself in here. And panel goes, okay, I can do that. Let me arrange all my children. I'll get back to you in a sec. Panel says, okay, you know what? I gave each of my children a specific space and a specific XY, and here's all the space that I needed. I'm giving it back to you. And layout says, sweet, I'll see you at the tables. LOL. Oh, wrong button. Okay, so with that, putting it all together really quickly for you guys. I'm going to open up my full Wish Explorer application. In here, I've got a splatter panel, which takes all the children that are added to a panel and lays them out at a random XY and gives it a random rotation. It will use, however, the priority of a particular child to determine how big it should be. So in here, I have one public attached property for my splatter panel called priority. So I've defined splatterpanel.priority. And then inside of my measure override, I call measure on all my children. I don't have to do a lot of logic here because it's at a random XY, and so I don't care how big the children draw themselves. And then I pass back the desired size. And what this means here, again, since I don't care, it can be as big as possible for this particular panel. I just need to make sure I don't pass back infinity because the layout system doesn't handle it very well. Inside of a range override is where I do a lot more of my heavy lifting for this particular panel. I first shuffle my children so I get a random XY. I create a random XY coordinate given how big the child is and how much space I'm actually given by the layout system to draw into. Then I iterate through each children and get the desired size of that child, and then create a child rect that she could draw into at that particular random XY. Now I do a couple of things here also. I fiddle with the render transforms and some of the effects, which isn't always good because you're stomping on your children, but it's a demo, so I decided to go for it. And then finally, you arrange your child at that particular child with that particular child rect. So now, going to run this, and you'll see our splatter panel in a moment. This will actually start us off by looking at a login page for my WishPot wish viewer. I'm going to log in, and because this third-party web service actually, I can get to see my particular wishes, I have to authenticate, which I do. And then it sends me back. Unfortunately, the local host doesn't handle redirects really well, so I will manually refresh. And here, coming back from wishbot.com, are all my wishes. Here's my 5-star one. And look, this is a list box. I can multi-select it. That's a new feature. Go Silverlight 3. I can unselect these, and you can see my splatter panel splat itself. And just to show all the fun that you can have with a layout, one of my dev leads, Dave Railia, created an even wackier panel called Radial Panel. It's nothing like gratuitous layout when you're trying to build a demo. So I'm going to comment out my splatter panel and add in his radial panel. Comment out this resplatter because it doesn't apply anymore, and rerun it. Now I can log in again, see my wishes, and as they come down from the web, this one looks normal until you add more. And then it just gets a little silly. And of course, that's not what I meant by enhancing brand necessarily, but it is definitely fun. Okay, so going back to our slides. Hopefully over the last hour or so, you learned a lot about the Silverlight control model and how you can really use that power of styling and skinning and data binding and layout to create these controls that are very rich, that are in line with the overall look and interaction that you want on your site and with the brand image of your company, and that you'll create even more amazing apps in Silverlight 3 than you did in Silverlight 2. My blog is up here, scorps.com/work. I'll be posting all the samples that you saw up there in the next couple of days, so check it out. Also, in order to get all the samples to work, you will have to request a developer key from wishbot.com. I wanted to also give a shout out to those guys, Tom and John, for helping me put together a lot of the back end of this, so I appreciated that. And finally, of course, your favorite site, silverlight.net. There's a lot of good information up there, and there are also a bunch of forums. And the product team does actually look at the forums. So if you have feedback or you have questions, please get active in those forums and list your questions and your priorities and your bugs. So that would be great. Again, my name's Karen, and thank you. You guys were great.